Hi, everybody. My name is David Kramer. I'm the director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And for those of you who have been with us for book talks before, you know that this is what I have described, and I mean it very seriously, as one of my great privileges, one of our great privileges, to be able to sponsor talks that feature important books of Jewish interest that you otherwise might not know much about. So here we've got another such opportunity, and this is, contrary to what I said a couple of weeks ago mistakenly in another book talk, this is our final book talk of this academic year, and a distinguished opportunity it is. Leonard Greenspoon is someone that many of you know. I assume that explains the great turnout we have for this lunch hour. I should, before I introduce him, I should actually also say that we've typically done these events in the evening, but we wanted to see what kind of draw would we get if we did it as a lunch hour. And as I watch some of you actually enjoying your lunches on your screens, that's great. It's perfect. What that means is that this is an hour that we can take advantage of. Leonard Greenspoon is a distinguished professor who many of you know. He's made a wide range of contributions. And he is also someone who has taken care to convene, to bring together scholars over the years for workshops and meetings, and to publish the proceedings of that. His own work on Jews in antiquity and questions of biblical concern are, again, his reputation precedes him. The topic of this book is one of great importance, Jewish Bible translations. He will obviously have far more to say about it than I will, but I do want to say that this is a topic that has interested me, and I'm sure many of you, for a very long time. This is the first comprehensive book-length study of Jewish Bible translations. The truth is that in many times and places, many Jews have not known Hebrew well enough to access the Hebrew Bible in its original language. The Jews have spoken the languages of the lands in which they found themselves. And an example from my own field, I study and write about rabbinics, amongst other things. It's well known that during the classical rabbinic period, the rabbis, or whoever they were speaking for, had to institute a procedure according to which the reading of the Torah in public would be effectively simultaneously translated, because the Hebrew was unavailable to many who would be hearing its public reading, and the Aramaic translation was essential. There are different details in different times and different places, but overall the point is the same. Jews have needed translations, and those translations are extremely significant, and there is no better person to be speaking about them than Leonard Greenspoon. So Leonard, please, the floor is yours. I am going to highlight you while you're presenting. Everyone should know that after the initial presentation, there will be opportunity for questions and discussion. Please stay on mute, though, during the presentation. So I'm spotlighting you for everyone. There you are. Go right ahead.
Thank you so much, David. It is a real honor and a pleasure to be able to interact with your audience today. And I could tell you, and I'm sure many have, how important the JTS library has been in my research. And actually, I don't know if it's open. I know it was closed for a while. I don't know what the COVID-19 restrictions are. But hopefully, if the library is not open fully now, it will be soon. I teach at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. Been there almost 25 years. But I'm not in Omaha. I've been teaching remotely, as have many other faculty. And we have a house in Milford, Connecticut, which is about 60 miles east of the city, 15 to 20 minutes away from New Haven. And that's where I've been since December and will be here through August. So perhaps that'll be the opportunity to go to the library in person again, if that's.
Up to 100.
Can you hear me okay? Meanwhile, David and I were talking a while back about this, this presentation, and he asked me a question which I'd really never thought about. And it's such a good question that I thought I would shape my brief presentation around it. And he said, David asked, what are some of the surprising things you found working on a variety of Jewish Bible translations? I said, wow, what a great question. The answer is necessarily what I would call idiosyncratic, because what surprises you is what you didn't know. And there are some of these translations that I've been working on for quite a while, and some I had not. But I thought simply by going through essentially each chapter, most every chapter is a translation into a different version, into a different language, and simply talk about what surprised me. So the book works primarily, it's primarily chronological, and then by language, culture, by the a particular language, its culture, depending on the language. It could be hundreds of years of translating, and others a much briefer period of time. So naturally, working chronologically, I would start off with the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, as well as what we understand through Rabbinic Judaism as the Hebrew Bible, plus other books that were written in Semitic, plus some works which composed in Greek. And I take it as a given that the work on the Septuagint began somewhere in the first quarter of the 3rd century BCE, let's say 275 BCE. And we have no eyewitness accounts of this event. We have some that purport to be. But looking at all the evidence, it seems that this was the time in which the translation took place, beginning with the Torah, and centered in Alexandria. And so as I was thinking about this, what's surprising to me? Well, say, why was a translation of the Hebrew Bible necessary in Alexandria, Egypt? And there's an obvious answer. Jews were no longer speaking, comprehending Hebrew, and they were in a society which was Hellenized. Greek was the language that everyone was using. Jews needed to use it. Jews were forgetting Hebrew, translated the Bible into Greek. That's certainly one of the main reasons why we translate. But then I thought about it a bit. According to our best evidence, Jews arrived in large numbers in Alexandria around 300 BCE, that is shortly after Ptolemy established his dynasty. And now we're talking about 15 or 20 years later that the earliest part of the Septuagint was produced. Is it likely that quickly everybody forgot, or most people forgot Hebrew? And then I realized that there are other factors that we need to take into account. So for example, according to one view, the translation of the Torah is in essence an interlinear translation. That is, it's quite a literal translation, and it would have been used in schools in order to be part of the pedagogy of teaching Jews, not just young Jews, but all Jews, getting them into the Greek language over a slow process. Well, this is just a beginning of the process, and that makes sense. Another possibility is that, or probability, is that just as David was mentioning, it is well documented that Aramaic translations accompanied reading of the Torah scroll in Hebrew in some congregations in the rabbinic period. It is tempting to think, although we have no secure evidence, that the same thing was happening in Hellenistic Greek-speaking synagogues, about which, frankly, we don't know that much. But it's certainly possible that Septuagint was produced in part to go along with the reading of the Hebrew when people were in the process of having less and less fluency in Hebrew. Just that I guess that unlike some of my colleagues who like either or answers, it's either this or that, I tend to the messy view of history, which is it's all kinds of factors going on, all of which reinforce each other. By the way, it's very interesting, as David aptly observed, it's been rare for there to be a Jewish community where most people knew Hebrew. But it's interesting that, jumping ahead a bit to the earliest Yiddish translations, including the famous Sena Urena, they were especially targeted to women and children. They could be used in the home and the school. That was seemed to be almost a facade that men, adult men, knew the Hebrew. They didn't need to have a translation. Undoubtedly, that was not true then, and it's not true today either. So from the Septuagint, it got me to thinking about the different kinds of motivations which lead individuals or committees within the Jewish community to translate the Bible, and the different ways in which they do that. I want to speak a bit about the Targums. So as David correctly pointed out, the Targums became part of the worship service for any number of centuries among Jews. And the Targums, unlike the Septuagint, became part of traditional Jewish teaching and learning. So I had always thought that the Targums were paraphrastic. That is, they were very free translations. And there's all kinds of stuff in there, and they just, pretty much weren't concerned with the Hebrew they were translating and felt, oh, we can just add all this stuff here and not be too concerned with it. And that turns out not to be true. The Targums are not paraphrastic. In fact, the Targums are literal translations, quite literal translations into Aramaic of the Hebrew, and that Hebrew appears to be very similar to our traditional or Masoretic Hebrew text, to which were added all kinds of midrashic, we would call midrashic enhancements. But these enhancements and the literal translation, you might think, well, that was done by two different groups. But according to the best Targumic scholars, this was done by the same individuals or groups that produced the literal translation of the Hebrew, also produced an amazing amount of, or I don't mean to say producers, they invented it, they incorporated an enormous amount of what, again, we would call midrashic, sometimes Haggadic, that is adding to the story, sometimes halachic, modifying the biblical law in accordance with their practice. And it raises a question, is that a translation? Well, Targum means translation. We don't have any of the Targumists, that is those responsible for the Targums, any kind of a memoir from any of them about why they did what they did. But it invites us to ask the question, are there limits to translation? Can something be so literal that you can't even understand it? Or can something be so free that it seems to be completely unmoored from or untethered from the original? And so I don't have an answer to the question, but I raise all these different possibilities. And with that in mind, I look at the Arabic translation. It's with the Arabic translation produced by Saja Gaon in around 900 of the Common Era. It's the first time that we actually know the translator, know his name, and know a great deal about him. So a minute ago, I spoke of what used to be the general language I used to describe different translations, free and literal. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as we understand that they're not opposites. It's not either free or literal. It's like a continuum from very literal, which would be, I would say, an interlinear translation, which you really can't understand without having the original right there, to very free, which I would call a paraphrase. And over the last decades, we have jettisoned those terms with good reason. And for literal translation, the term most in use is functional, is formal translation. And for free translation, the term most in use is functional. Now, why is this worthwhile? Because a literal translation, the literal translators believe that the meaning of words and the meaning of phrases and the meaning of passages is inextricably connected with the form in which they are presented. So let's face it, the differences between Aramaic and Hebrew in antiquity, as well as in the modern world, are not all that extreme. But the differences between Hebrew and Greek, one being a Semitic language and one being an Indo-European language, these are very different. And so as a translator works, she, he, or they can ask the question, as I'm translating, do I want to keep as much of the form of the original language as possible? In doing that, the translation becomes more literal. The translation becomes also more foreign, as it were, and the translation requires more effort on the part of the audience, because they're not reading Greek or Russian or Hungarian or English as we would today. It has a foreign element to it. But then again, let's say for us, the Hebrew Bible comes from a different time period, a different culture, a different language group. It's not English. It can be in English. So that is the basis for a formal or literal translation. The free or functional translator asked a different question. These individuals ask, what did the translator want to convey? What did the translators want to convey to their audience? How do we say it? It isn't that the form is totally ignored, but they're much more likely to adopt their main interest in the need, their perceived needs of the audience. That is their audience, who whether they're Greek speaking or English speaking. And the result is that the translation sounds more like the contemporary language in which it's being translated. Now, why do I mention all of this? Because intuitively, I thought that all Jewish translations, or certainly most of them up until the very, very modern period, would be formal, would be literal translations. And that's not untrue. Most of them are. But Thaja's translation from Hebrew into Arabic was a functional translation. That is, his primary goal was to make the Hebrew Bible understandable for his Arabic-speaking audience. And as such, he made a lot of language choices and a lot of stylistic choices where the form of the Hebrew was trumped by, if you will, the need to take the function and put it into Arabic. And I thought that was, I thought that was pretty fascinating. Also, I would generally say that one of the goal of a Jewish translation of the Bible is not to supplant, that is, take the place of the original, but to supplement it. And that for the overall, if we look at overall, Jewish translations or Jewish versions generally show one way or another that they are in fact translations. Sometimes they have the Hebrew facing the language, whether it's English or French or Spanish, whatever it is. Generally, the Parashota mentioned, some Hebrew is included in it. And it's clear, because I think the translations are in and of themselves very important. And I emphasize the role of the translators. It was not supplanting, supplementing. The exception to that is that Sadra Gaon, in producing this Arabic translation, which we call the Tafsir, intended it to be the Bible for Arabic-speaking Jews. He intended it to be not only the better than and taking the place of earlier Arabic translations, but also essentially taking the place of the Hebrew. This struck me as quite surprising. If we move ahead, I'm sort of looking at the clock and looking at this and said, okay, I'm going to talk for 10 minutes, but 10 minutes could be perhaps a little bit more, because it's a way of introducing. The next chapter that I did was on Yiddish and German translations, and there's the longest history of Jewish Bible versions is in Judeo, German, Yiddish, and in German. So a name I knew, and many of you are familiar with, is Moses Mendelsohn, the famous Enlightenment hero and significant leader in the second half of the 1700s. And I had always heard, to the extent I knew anything about his translation, that his is the first German translation. All translations prior to that for Jews in German-speaking lands had been in Yiddish. And I was aware, and this turned out to be correct, I wasn't too surprised about this, that Mendelssohn's translation was the first into High German, into the German of the workplace, the German of the courts, the German of the intellectual circles, and what have you. And that the reason why Mendelssohn did this was that for the first time, Jews were gaining access to full civil rights, which included not just voting, but participating in all aspects of life. And he felt that Jews would be, they would be shackled by, if they spoke Yiddish, which he thought of, as many others did, as a jargon, essentially as low class. They needed to speak correct German, and his translation was incorrect German. And that in fact is correct. I mean, that is in fact one of his goals. But the other goal of his that I hadn't fully realized was that he was concerned that when Jews read translations produced under Christian auspices, they weren't getting the true Jewish Bible. He didn't blame Christian theologians for not knowing and feeling the Jewish exegetical traditions as he did, but he did want to make a major effort to convey the richness of the Jewish exegetical tradition to his audience. And this he did in an extended commentary. And his work together is called the Biur, which actually means more commentary. And it reminds us of the fact that many Jewish Bible translations are, that the commentaries to them is at least as important in the translation. And in many instances, the commentary is really more important. The translation is there to provide a source for the commentary. So it is characteristic of Jewish translations historically that there'll be extensive commentary that goes along with the translation. So it's a means, it can be a means of teaching language. And this is what happened with the Jewish Publication Society translation of 1917, the one that I grew up on, and most of you did if you're of my age, which was in essence a revision of the King James. And the editor-in-chief of that volume, Max Margolis, who was himself an immigrant from Eastern Europe, felt that in producing an English language version, he wanted to make sure that immigrant Jews spoke English well. He didn't think they would learn it well from the Lower East Side where they lived, or from the newspapers, or vaudeville. So his translation was intentionally in King James style English, because this was a means of acculturating. Sometimes I might say assimilating. Assimilating can be a dirty word, if you will, a negative word. So enculturating Jews into their society. And just to jump ahead a bit, as I looked at, when I got, so each of these topics I devoted a chapter to, and then I had a chapter on 5 other languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Hungarian, and Russian. And there was some method in my madness. I didn't choose these completely on an arbitrary basis. But when, for example, I got to the Hungarian translation, what I found was that the person responsible for this translation in the mid-19th century was very much involved in the process of Magyarization. I think that's the correct way to pronounce it. That is, to establish a Hungarian identity. And as part of establishing a Hungarian identity, he felt it was important for the Jews resident in Hungary to be much better, much more knowledgeable about the Hungarian language. And so, similar to what Mendelsohn did, his translation was intended as a way of incorporating Jews into the society. At the same time, his translation was different from either Protestant or Catholic translations. So it was at the same time a way of inculcating Jewish traditions and values. And this struck me as interesting, and it's paralleled more broadly by the Russian translations, because I generally think of nationalist movements, that's Magyarization was a nationalist movement, as being antithetical to minorities, including Jews. But many of the translators, or some of the translators, saw it differently. So that was true with Mendelsohn, it's true with the Hungarian translators, it's true with the Russian translators. And in a sense, it's true with the Jewish Publication Society translation. That is, establishing linguistic competency in the host language was seen as a means of achieving two complementary, in their view, two complementary goals: becoming better Americans, better Hungarians, better Russians, to the extent that was possible, and being better, more competent, more knowledgeable Jews. And to me, this variety of motives is absolutely one of the most fascinating aspects of the entire process. So again, one of the things that I set out to do from the very beginning was to look at the translators and the social, cultural, historical, theological context in which they worked. Naturally, there was some, or turns out with the Septuagint, an area that I was most knowledgeable about. English language versions, I was able, actually fortuitously, I knew Isaac Leeser's translation, didn't know it well. I knew the JPS, Jewish Publication Society translation, 1917, and the 1965 translation, the Tanakh, but I didn't know that there was anything else. And I was able to spend a year as a Skirball Fellow teaching at Oxford University. And all of a sudden I was able through the Bodleian and through other resources that they have to come into contact with more than a dozen translations produced by, we call Anglo-Jewish translations, produced by British Jews. Some of these, for the most part, I'd never heard of these individuals. Some of them I had, and is well documented, but not well known from a period of around 1780. I went through the very end of the 19th century when the center of action moved from England to the United States. And one of the most interesting factors there was that almost without exception, every British translator stayed close to the King James. And it led to the observation that the King James translation, that's what it's a Protestant produced translation, had a lasting influence among Jews really up until the 1960s when the new JPS translation came out. That's functionally equivalent and therefore is not dependent on any earlier translation. This is also this interaction between Jewish translations and Christian translations is absolutely fascinating. And just to mention one more aspect, you may remember, it was a big deal in my life. Back in 2011, we were celebrating the 400th anniversary of the King James Version. And there was a lot of writing about it. There was a lot of discussion about it. There were a number of substantial books written for what I would call a popular general audience, scholarly based, but for popular audience. Not one of those works mentioned that although the King James translators were all Protestants, many of them were deeply imbued in knowledge of Hebrew, the Hebrew language, and biblical exegesis. The general term for such individuals is Christian Hebraist. And so one of the things I wanted to document in the book was just how, I would say, quote unquote, Jewish the King James Version is, especially most often used by the King James translators were the works of Kimke and Rashi. Rashi because of his emphasis on the Peshat, or what I would call the plain reading of the text, and Kimke because he wrestled with a great many grammatical, lexicographical issues that interested the translators. That doesn't mean that the translators were necessarily receptive to Jews, actual Jews, and officially there were no Jews in England until 50 years after the King James came out, although it turns out there were any number there under a variety of surreptitious reasons. But it meant that the Jewish influence on Bible translation goes beyond the Jewish versions themselves, which are in and of themselves fascinating. So the one thing I often forget to even do is I'll show you. There's the book. I would like to take credit for the title or for the subtitle because I love alliteration. I did not come up with it. My editor at JPS did. Jewish Bible Translations: Personalities, Passions, Politics, Progress. So summing all this up, as David mentioned, I guess I would say I make the claim that this is the first full volume length study of Jewish Bible translation, and looking at Jewish Bible translations as a process and seeing the interconnections between the translators. I feel as if this is a topic, and David again alluded to this, I believe correctly, that it's fascinating, but hasn't gotten as much attention as I feel it should in Judaism. So I've been trying to take the issue of Jewish Bible translation from the peripheries and put it into the center. And I guess I can say, whoa, yeah, that's some success here, because here we are, my speaking to this group today. I will stop now. I suspect, David, that there are lots of questions people have already asked. Yes?
There are a lot of questions. I was about to say that you certainly are right about the interest in the topic, because the questions have been coming in very, very quickly, and I will convey them to you. I mean, from the very beginning, there have been questions. Just a couple of quick questions, though, before I take the audience's questions. The first I asked you yesterday, but to provide you an opportunity to impress everybody, how are you able to evaluate all of these many translations in these different languages?
Okay, there's two answers. I mean, two different parts of it. Part of it is that I've worked substantially on the Septuagint. I've worked in the Targums. I know Aramaic. Obviously, I know English. I'm conversant in French and Italian, some Spanish. Arabic I learned once, but wouldn't say I'm proficient in it. Hungarian, I know only from my wife's family, listen to them. And I thought I immerse where I don't have primary, haven't done primary research or don't have primary linguistic facility. I immerse myself in the topic. And in that, I was particularly helped by my editor at the Jewish Publication Society, because I would write something, she would say, yes, but, and there would be a question. And her question, one of the questions was about Russian Bible translations. And I said, I actually don't know the answer. And I would spend a week delving into the answer. And it's so the experience of writing the book and thinking about the book and doing the research, I get very excited about it. And I admit not everybody can share my excitement, but at least, maybe can at least understand it and say, whoa, maybe it is something worthwhile.
Great. Two quick, maybe quick, technical questions. One, until at least recent centuries, most of these translations have been written in Hebrew characters. So someone mentioned this in their question. Do you have a theory about that? Then the other question is, this is also based upon a listener's question. Did you concentrate on what you would call errors in translation?
David Kramer.
Or the like?
Okay. So for the first one, the two translations, I mean, besides Yiddish, which has always written in Hebrew characters, the two translations which were produced first in Hebrew characters, of which I'm aware, is Sadia Gaon's Tafsir and Moses Mendelsohn's Bior. And presumably they were originally put in Hebrew because the Jewish audience would have been familiar with Hebrew, and so presumably that's why I don't. And then each of them was then eventually translated into Arabic and into German, partly I think as a response to the version's popularity. And while Jews could read the Hebrew characters and then from that learn Arabic or German, a more general audience would not be able to do that. And so part of this book, not to go far off from the topic, has to do with particularly starting in the 19th century with how you package a Bible translation. And so the language, if it's written in Hebrew characters, that focuses on an audience, but it also limits an audience. Now I've forgotten I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second.
That's fine. I asked about erroneous translations, and I put that in scare quotes because the translators may or may not have considered it, considered them to be errors. But did you focus on that at all?
Yes, I mean, I'm not okay. So I don't know if I want to speak of if errors, but as distinctive features. Just very quickly, because I did focus on this quite a bit. Translations that involved God's emotional life, anthropopathisms, or God having human shape, anthropomorphisms, abound in the Hebrew Bible. Any translation which is translating what's we say in the Bible would translate in that way. And then the various members of the audience who are reading or hearing it would sort of say, well, no, this is a metaphorical, or how we understand it. but both the Targums, this is quite well known in the Targums, but also in Saadia Gaon's work, all anthropomorphisms relating to God, all anthropopathisms are translated out. They don't exist. So, for example, there's in Saadia, God laughs. That's God laughs. Hey, that's interesting. That's what the text says. In Saadia, God makes people laugh. Whoa, now that's erroneous to the extent I think this doesn't reflect what the text says. But I guess I would err on the side of saying these are just variety of emphases, trying to understand what motivated, for example, two different translators to avoid the anthropomorphisms and the anthropopathisms, even though there they were in the Hebrew. And then there are a zillion others. I'm sorry, don't mean to be facetious about that. There are a zillion others. Just to give you, see how hard it is for me to be succinct, but just to give you an example, in Genesis 2:2, on the seventh day, God ceased to work, or God stopped all the work he was creating for 7 days. So on the seventh day, God, that's what the text says, Bayom HaShishi, on the seventh day. That's how it translated. But that creates an issue because according to every other biblical reference, God created one of 6 days. He wasn't working on the seventh day and then stopping. And therefore, there would be, for example, Art Scroll or some of the other more focused on an Orthodox community will change that to say by the seventh day or prior to the seventh day. Now, are these errors? Well, certainly not the plain reading of the text. And so theologically, ideologically, culturally motivated changes which move away from what I would understand the plain reading of the text. Not even to mention in Saadia, don't boil a kid in his mother's milk becomes, in his text, don't eat milk and meat together. Whoa, seems like an error to me, but yes, okay.
Yeah, got it. Several people are interested in this distinction that you referenced several times, offered different vocabularies for, between more literal translations and more paraphrastic or formal. I'm trying to put a few questions together here. Maybe the way to do it is to ask you, which English translation, of which there are many, do you prefer? Which English translation would you recommend to others and why? And now we'll learn something about the way you balance the different criteria.
I was concerned someone might ask that question because alas, my answer is it all depends. Maybe that would be better if I like this. When I was in graduate school, and I remember thinking decades ago, of course, the only English translation that we could possibly consider valid is one that's formal, one that's as little as possible. This paraphrastic and this free translations, they have no value. Hopefully I've enhanced my understanding, and what I try to do today, and I've written something called through the Biblical Archaeology Society, something called the Bible Buyer's Guide, and I go through some Jewish and Protestant Christian Protestant and Catholic translations, Messianic Jewish translations, several dozen of them, is to judge a translation based on what it says it's going to do, what its aim is. I'm not the audience for many of these translations, but does the translation do what the translators say it's going to do? All right, so talking about trying to focus in a bit on this, the translation that most of us use for most circumstances is the Jewish Publication Society version, 1965, the Tanakh. It replaced the earlier Jewish Publication Society translation. It's used almost everywhere outside of traditional synagogues. It is the translation of choice in Jewish communal activities. I have done, as I'm sure you have, a number of courses in adult education through our Jewish Community Federation and through my synagogue in Omaha. And the audience, like this audience, is well-versed in generally and Jewishly, not necessarily fluent, if you could be fluent in Biblical Hebrew. And we'll be looking at something and we'll be looking at the translation, we'll have the Hebrew text, and someone will say, wait a minute, this JPS translation is not what the Hebrew says. And it's because the Jewish Publication Society translation is a freer or functional translation. It's easier to read. It's already, even though the functional translation is meant to be update is somewhat out of date now because it's 50 years old. I don't think there is actually a revision of the Jewish Publication Society version going on now. It's another revision, generally dealing with issues of gender and inclusivity. But that's a perfectly good translation. Art Scroll, in its own terms, is a perfectly good translation. Art Scroll is, of course, aimed at a more traditional audience, and one of the aspects of Art Scroll which is distinctive is that it introduces into the translation Jewish exegetical points. A classic example, very quickly, has to do with when we start counting the Omer. And the biblical text says we start counting the Omer the day after the Sabbath, Passover. So why don't we begin counting the Omer the day after the Sabbath? We don't do that because rabbinic interpreters understood that Sabbath there meant first day. Is that right? I can't say it's right or wrong. That's what it is. So a translation I would prefer says on the day after the Sabbath. And then if you want to have a note about the rabbinic interpretation and Jewish practice, you do it. The Art Scroll and some of the other more traditional translations, so-called traditional translations, would have on the day after the first day, or the day after the feast day, understood to be the first day. Is that an error in translation? The Peshat it ain't. I mean, the standard reading it's not. But so the long and short of it is that when I was in undergraduate school in the 60s, graduate school in the 70s, just about everybody under every circumstance used the Revised Standard Version. But that's no longer the case. And it's really a matter of what it is you want, out of the translation. I think the JPS translation is fine for some purposes. Art Scroll is excellent for other purposes. And now, of course, we've got another entire genre, if you will, maybe subgenre of translations produced by Robert Alter, Richard Freeman, Everett Fox, where they're done by individuals who are not connected with the Jewish community in the same way that the other translators were. And their translations transcend as well as incorporating the Jewish world. And they're amazing. I realize this is a long-winded, in some ways unsatisfactory answer, but ultimately I'm a proponent of almost every translation once we understand what we can get out of it.
Wonderful.
David, I'd like to ask Leonard a question. May I do so?
Whoever it is, please go right ahead.
Okay. So I did this in the chat, and I asked Leonard the question whether he agrees with the very common term to translate is to lie. Tradura is to dadera. Take, for example, the Shema, which I pointed out in the NIV translates the V'kol modecha as with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. The last two, with all your strength. Yet literally the last two words translate as all of your very. Now, it's true that that doesn't make much sense to the English reader, but yet adding all your strength may not be the proper translation. So the real question I have is, how do we reconcile literalism with functionalism, which was mentioned by Leonard? How does he do that? How does he feel about that?
Thank you. And that's I would say it's at the heart of translation. And it's okay. So I don't know that translation is interpretation, and translation in and of itself is only a partial representation. So you've got to determine what it is that you feel is essential. And if, for example, the Hebrew text, just talking about the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew text really doesn't I can't make sense out of it. So I can translate it in a way that really doesn't make sense, and that would be more of a literal translation. I can't make sense out of it, and there's certainly parts of the Hebrew Bible where, at least for me, that's the case. Or I can say, you know what, I really looked this over. I and my committee members have looked this over, and we've decided that on balance, that even though we're not totally sure what this means, and the JPS editors, translators often say Hebrew uncertain, or meaning of Hebrew uncertain, but this is what I think it means. That's what I'm going to put in my translation. In this instance, I prefer that when there's the translator perceives a difficulty in the Hebrew, because we're talking about translating Hebrew Bible, he, she, or they reflect that in their translation, and that I have written a lot about. And just to give you another example, and the one you have is an excellent one. Just going back to something I said a minute ago, Genesis 2:2, on the seventh day God ceased work. That's problematic. I mean, most people would just read it away, but it's problematic when you think about it, because on the seventh day, God, he should have ceased before then. All right. So that's a difficulty. Maybe it's not the largest difficulty. My translation will have that. I won't paper over the difficulties, and that even when we can translate the Hebrew text fairly functionally, there's still difficulties, because they're, whether or not they're out and out contradictions, there's sure a lot of places which don't harmoniously relate to other sections of the Hebrew Bible. I want my translation to reflect that. In that sense, I am a proponent of the formal translation technique, in the sense that one of the effects, one of the goals of the functional translation is to produce a smooth translation. But all of you know, any of you who work with the Hebrew Bible, it isn't smooth all the time. So there's some place in the middle, whereas some functional translations the functional translation of some parts of the Hebrew Bible strike me as absolutely perfect. This tendency among functional translators just to paper over any distinction, or in the case of Art Scroll, that's a formal translation. But the difficulties that the Hebrew reader would have, or could have, the English reader should have. So I think hopefully that's in the ballpark of an answer. Thank you.
We've got just a few minutes, but there's one topic that it occurs to me you've touched on kind of in an indirect way, but I want to make it more direct. I'm interested in the authority of translations, or even, I think we could use the word canon, that there are certain translations that have become canonical. That's certainly true of the Septuagint. It is arguably true of the Targum Onkelos on the Torah. Perhaps it's true of the King James Version. Do you discuss this in your book, and what would you say about it?
Yes, in several ways. I discuss it. One of the one of the interesting factors is that when I alluded to there being more than a dozen Anglo-Jewish translations throughout the 19th century, most of which I'd never heard of before. And I think it's fair to say most British Jews would not have either. 3 of those translations in their introductory preface materials say this translation was sanctioned by the chief rabbi. And I went, whoa, wait a minute. What do you mean sanctioned by the chief rabbi? And then it just sounds like we've got an authorized version. If they have an authorized version, the King James authorized version, and in a sense, yes. But what's noted there is that the translation is sanctioned by the chief rabbi. It was, all of these were Rabbi Adler, was sanctioned for use in the home and in the school. That whereas to the extent the King James is an authorized version, what's it authorized for? It's authorized for use in the Anglican Church. No Jewish translation, to my understanding, has that same kind of theological, liturgical, in that sense, canonical approach. And as so, for example, just again very briefly, David mentioned before, for many centuries in some synagogues, the Torah would be read verse by verse from the written scroll, just as we do today. After each verse, someone would say the Aramaic translation. It was not to be read, it was to be spoken. Now, exactly how this worked, I have no idea. But there was a distinction between the authority of the Hebrew text, which is unique, and the authority of the translation, which is supplemental, valuable but supplemental. That said, I think about one, but the earliest source we have for the origins of the Septuagint is called the letter of Aristeas, Aristeas. It purports to be an eyewitness account of the translations of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy by Jews brought in from Jerusalem in Alexandria, Egypt, under the auspices of Ptolemy II. At the end of that, the reason I mentioned that here, it's not an eyewitness account, but doesn't mean it has no value. At the end of that, there's an anathema, there's a curse to the effect that anyone who changes any of the words of this Greek text is anathematized. They're cursed. And it reads like and sounds very much like some of the language that the Torah mentions of the reception of the Torah. And it appears as if among some people, just as Saja wanted his Arabic translation to be essentially the Bible, some people wanted this version of the Greek translation to be the Bible. And in the case of the British, where we have this hierarchical ecclesiastical structure, the chief rabbi actually formally endorsed, essentially authorized these. Yes, so it's not usually at that standard of authorized, but then again, rather than establish, oh, these are the rules based on what I think it should have been, and then these don't follow the rules. The rules were, again, I'll use the term messy, and not everybody did the same thing.
Okay, wonderful. I mean, there's so much more that we could discuss, but our time is up. I have to say that what's evident to me as I'm watching the chat, this is the most active chat conversation we've had for a book talk in a very long time, which shows the interest of the work you've done and the very engaging way that you've presented it to us. Someone put a link to the Amazon purchase of the book in the chat. I'm sure everybody knows how to do that. If you're looking at the book, go ahead, and maybe sometime when we're all back together, we can set up a line of people who have acquired the book, and you can sit and sign it for them the way we used to do with book talks that are in person. But many of the people who were here wouldn't have been able to do that. So I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Leonard, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you for inviting me.
We look forward to seeing you again in the fall for book talks, both online and occasionally in person. So have a wonderful day and a wonderful summer.